Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to this fourth chapter of my SwiftUI training course. Today we are going to focus on the navigation. How do you navigate? How do you transition between views and between screens inside a SwiftUI app? Last week was quite a big chapter. We covered state management, and it took a bit of time, a bit over 2 hours, if I remember it correctly. Today, I think it should be slightly faster, and also a topic that is a little bit more maybe approachable. All of that to say that this chapter should be easier than the previous one. But we're going to build on what we actually did on the previous chapter, because we will start from the code that was made in the previous chapter, because it's just so much easier to talk about navigation when you already have an existing app that you can build upon. So let me tell you a bit about what we're going to cover in this chapter. We are going to cover the three main ways to navigate inside a SwiftUI app. And these three ways include what SwiftUI calls the navigation, which is about pushing and popping views onto a stack. And SwiftUI, just like UIKit, calls it navigation. It's a bit confusing because it's not the only kind of navigation out there. Then we'll talk about tab bar. So the tab bar you have at the bottom of a SwiftUI app to be able to transition between views, which are usually the main features, the main use cases of an app. And finally, we'll talk about modal views. How do you present a view on top of another in a modal fashion? We will also have a look at the new APIs that iOS 16 introduced. You might know that iOS 16 introduced quite a few things regarding push, pop, so stack-based navigation with the appropriately named navigation stack. But we'll also talk a bit about the new APIs that iOS 16 also added to modal presentation, because there were some new additions that are maybe a bit smaller, but they give you some flexibility that wasn't there before. And you will see that when you want to make a nice UX, these additions are actually quite welcome. Finally, like I said, we will be starting from the project of the previous chapter. So if you are following live, or if you want to write the code as I go along, you will want to start from the project that is at chapter 3, the project called State Management. Last thing I want to say before we get started is that if you are watching live, and I see that some people are watching live, which is awesome, remember that you have a chat to ask any question that you have, to make any remark that come to your mind. By doing so, first, I am able to help answer them as best as I can, but also the question and remark that you have are probably the exact same one than the people watching the replay are having. And so by asking them, there is a very good chance that you actually make it easier for the people watching the replay to get an answer to the question that they will probably have while watching the replay. So all of that to say, please ask questions. It's super useful for everyone. And now that I've said that, I can get started. One last thing. If you're watching on YouTube and you feel like you would like to download the videos and the Excel projects super easily, you have a link in the description to go to Gumroad, where you can buy the videos and Excel projects for any price, starting at $1. You just put in whatever price you want, and then you can download them. All right. So as I said, we are starting from the app we made in the last chapter, the chapter about state management. So a quick reminder about what we did. We actually built a reminder in this chapter. So I'm going to show you the preview of the main view of the app. So we built a to-do app in which we could manage a to-do list and be able to switch the items from not done state to a done state with some automatic ordering based on this isDone Boolean property. We also added a few ways to interact with the list, like deleting items, How do I get rid of that? I guess I can do done, okay. Like deleting items or reordering them. Okay, let me make it like that. Okay, so this is what we are starting from, and we are going to build a detail view this time. So what I would like to do is that when I click on a row, of course, if I click on the button, I still want to mark the item as done. But if I click anywhere, I would like to navigate to a detail view in which we can actually edit the content of the to-do item. I didn't add a plus button last time because it was just easier to have a JSON with preloaded data. It made like the app just more fluid to interact with. But I would still like to have a way to change the title, the description, maybe add the description when there isn't one. And so a nice way to do it can be to add a detail view and to navigate from the list view to the detail view. That's what we're going to implement. And as always, I'm looking at my script to make sure I am not forgetting anything. So first step will be to create a new SwiftUI view. I'm gonna hide the preview for now. So just like we had the to-do list view model, the to-do item row, I'm going to create another view that I will create. How do I name it? I call it to-do item detail, I guess. I'm just checking like the finished version of the project, how I had named it. I will call it to-do item detail view, like that. While I'm at it, I'm also going to put a bit of structure inside the files of my app because you can see it's starting to get a bit crowded there. So I'm just going to create a few new things. So I'm going to select all of the views. So this one, so to-do items, this view, to-do item row, and to-do item detail view, and the button also. I'm gonna do a right click and new group from selection. I'm gonna call them views, like that. To-do item is going to be in the model folder. These things, binding plus extensions, stateful preview wrapper, and array plus load, I will put them in a group that I will call helpers. Could have also called them utils. You get the idea. And finally, the view model, I could put it also in the model. Simple way to just add a bit of structure and make it easier for us to find what we are looking for, especially for me to so that I can easily identify what I want to use. Okay, so this is my detail view. Okay, so let's build this detail view, and you will see that it will also give us an opportunity to recap on what we learned in the last chapter. So this detail view, it will need to operate over some data. It's a detail view for a to-do item. So to display the to-do item, it needs to have a to-do item. So let's start by adding a property that is of type to-do item. Now, of course, we don't only want to display a to-do item. We also want to update it. We want to have text fields. And so we need to give a way to-do item detail view to update this to-do item. Right now, it wouldn't really update it because it would just get a copy of the to-do item passed down by the parent view. So this would be a top-down data flow, but that would not be the bottom-up part that we also want to achieve. If you followed last week, maybe you are already remembering what we should do to have this two-way data flow. I'm making extra sure that I don't use the word to give you the time to guess it for yourself. So if you're watching the replay and you are not super sure about what we should use to implement this two-way data flow, maybe it could be a good time to pause and take a look at the code we wrote in the last chapter, just for you to get back to the idea of what do we actually use to implement a two-way data flow in SwiftUI. I will give the answer. So what we want to implement is a two-way data flow, something that is often called a two-way binding. And so we want to have a binding on a to-do item. And the way to have this in a view is to use the @binding property wrapper, which is going to wrap the to-do item into a binding. This way we can get the value of the to-do item, but we can also set a new value to it. And this is what will allow our text fields to update the to-do item should the user choose to change the text that is either in the title or in the description. All right. Now, of course, we need a way to provide a to-do item inside the preview. So remember last time we used this pretty cool trick to have, I think I had it. Where did I have it? I think it was here, yes. We were using this pretty cool trick of having static properties. So we can still do the same thing here in the detail view. All right, like that. However, if we try to pass just the to-do item without description, I'm just going to rename it here to-do item. It will be simpler because there will be only that one. Here it won't work because to-do item detail view expects a binding and not just an item. So we saw two ways to deal with this. Either provide a constant binding, which would work if we only want to test the display, but we won't be able to update the to-do items. We won't be able to test that the text field actually work correctly, which is kind of a bummer, if you want my opinion. And so we had introduced this nice trick to have a stateful preview wrapper, which is just a view that doesn't contain any UI of its own. It just contains a subview that it displays, but it stores a value inside. And so by doing that, we have a place to store the value in a way where when it is updated, it does trigger a redraw of the UI. And by saying that, I think I am answering a question asked in the chat. So how does binding notify UI elements? This is where SwiftUI comes into play. So it is in SwiftUI's internal implementation that it listens to a change in the variable. So basically, when the setter of the wrap value of a binding is called, SwiftUI catches that and knows that it needs to recompute the body and compare the new body with the previous body to see what has changed and what needs to be updated. All of that to say that here I'm going to use my stateful preview wrapper like that. For the value, I pass the to-do item. And so now I have a binding on my to-do item, which will allow me to finally provide the argument that to-do item detail view expects. All right. Okay, the code is building. Perfect. Let me display the preview so that you can see what's being built. Okay, I'm going to zoom it a bit. All right, something like that. Okay, perfect. So for now, we have just a text that says hello world, but we're going to improve on it. So we want to display two text fields. One text field to edit the title of the to-do item. Let me show you what to-do item looks like. So we have an ID, which is a constant, a title and a description that the user can edit through text fields, and the isDone boolean that users can still edit through the button, even though edit is probably not the verb that the user has in mind when they press the button, but technically it is still an edit, just that editing a text is different in terms of UI than editing a boolean. And so we want these two strings to be editable. To do that, we're going to use two text fields. So let's try and do it. So I'm just using a VStack for now to organize my two text fields. Interesting question. Can we make the old field optional? So I'm going to try and rephrase it. I guess you wanted to say, can we make all the fields optional? So here you have noticed correctly that the title is non-optional and the description is optional. I made that on purpose to show you how to deal with the two possible cases. And we will see when I use text field whether or not it will have an impact, but I think it will have an impact. But here the reason why one is optional and one isn't, it's first and foremost to show you how to deal with the two cases. Here I still think it kind of makes sense to have this, because the title, you don't want it to be optional, you would like to be there, to always be one there. It might just be the empty string, but you would like to always be one there. Description being optional can make sense, even though you could also use the empty string as a default value. So I would say it's more a matter of preference. I don't really have a strong opinion, to be honest, in this example between optional and or like empty string. I think going with empty string can often make things a bit simpler than optional. But here I really wanted to show you how to deal with that case, to be thorough in the content of this course. So we're going to use a text field. I think we used one in the very first chapter about the basics of SwiftUI. So text field has a lot of possible initializers. Here we are going to use the one that takes a title key and a text. We can see in the description, title key is a localized string key, meaning that SwiftUI will look to see if there is a key matching the string I pass in my localizable .strings, and the text, which is a binding on a string. It's perfectly logical to have a binding here, because the text field needs a way to update the value that it is given. It won't just display the value like text does. Text field allows edition, and so to have edition, you need to have a binding, because you need to have a two-way data flow. I know I'm repeating this a lot, but it is so important to understand how SwiftUI app that I feel it's important for me to try and explain it as much as possible every time I have an opportunity for it. So text field, it will be title for this text field. And for the binding, so we will pass a binding on a property of the item, and we do that with this $syntax. So $syntax says, give me a binding, and it works because the item is already a binding. You can use dollar with a binding or an add_state property. And then by referring only to title, we are able to say I want a binding, but only to the property title, which is a string, and so everything matches regarding the types. So we have our first text field, and actually you can see that I can edit the content of the to-do item, which is pretty cool. So we have our first text field. Let's add now our second text field. You can see that now all the text is back. There's a good reason for it. It's because the initial value is this static property right there, and so whenever the preview gets re-rendered, we will go back to the default value. But it's good, it's what I want for testing, so it's no problem at all. So let's have the second text field. This time it will be the description for its title, and so for the text it displays, it will be a binding, but this time on the description. Oh, but look at this. We have an error. Remember when I told you that this optional might complicate things? That's exactly what happens. Because if we take a look at the signature of the initializer on text field, let me comment this code, you can see that it takes a binding to a string and not a binding to an optional string. And as we can see, thanks to the error, binding to an optional string is not a compatible type for a binding to a non-optional string. So how can we deal with that? I think in the previous chapter, I introduced a nice little helper in binding plus extension that was called onNewValue. And this thing allowed me to register a side effect when a new value was set to the binding. Well, in this case, we're going to add a new extension on binding, which I will call onEmpty, which will give a default value to my binding when the value is nil. So I think this will now this will work for not only for strings, for all types, and it's a way to basically provide a default value for your binding when you're dealing with a binding of an optional and you want to pass it to something that expects a binding to something that is non-optional. I see a question. In reality, do you group your data in view model or in view state object in view model like in Android Compose? So we do group data in view model. I won't go back in how to do it because it was the content of the previous chapter. So I'm sorry if it's a little bit hard to follow during this live, but you can definitely check out after the chapter 3 of the course, which is about state management and which goes into details how to use a view model and when to use add state to store data inside a view and when you should go to a view model to store data inside a dedicated object that is separate from the view. Now let's add to our nice little helper on binding. So I'm going to add a new method on binding. This way I can call it just like I would call a modifier on a view. So I'm calling it when empty. And I'm adding a generic argument to it wrapped because I'm going to refer to something that is wrapped into an optional. You will see how this plays out in just a few seconds. I will need to provide an argument to this modifier because I wanted to return a default value that is of type wrapped. So wrapped is the type inside the optional. So in the case where I want to use this modifier with the text field, wrapped would be the type string. Okay, and I'm going to return a binding of wrapped. Okay, and now we get to the more complicated part for this because this is the part where we are going to use the Swift generic type system. So I want to say that wrapped is what is contained inside an optional binding. And to do that, I use a where clause where I say where value is something defined inside binding. If we take a look at how binding is implemented, we can see that binding is a generic type over a value. You can put whatever you want inside a binding. So I'm referring to this value right here. And I'm saying I want this method when empty to be available when a value can be expressed as something inside an optional. And so this is what my generic type wrapped here is. It represents what is in the optional. And so here you can see it kind of like some sort of conditional generic in the sense that I say I want the method when empty to be available when the generic type value of my binding can be decomposed into an optional something, and I name this something wrapped so that I can refer to it here, and I'm basically providing a default value for this wrapped, which makes sense because if you have an optional something and you provide a default value of type something, just going to redo it without saying something because saying something is a bit confusing. If you have an optional t, so of an optional of type t, and you provide a value of type t, then you are able to go from optional t to t because for the nil case, you can return the default value. So the default value is a way to break out of the optionality. I guess we could phrase it like that. There are several ways to break out of optionality. You can either deal with the nil values, you can crash when it's nil, or you can provide a default value when it's nil. And basically, what I'm doing here with my whenEmpty method is just like the nil coalescing operator, except that the nil coalescing operator works on values and not on bindings. That's why I am defining the method whenEmpty. If you know Swift well, you might know that Swift does support operator overloading. So it would be possible to overload the nil coalescing operator to work with bindings. But I would still recommend doing this whenEmpty because it makes it more clear that you're dealing with a binding and not just a value. But if you have like some experience with Swift and you want to try as an exercise, I can give you this exercise. Like you can try to re-implement when empty as an overload of the nil coalescing operator. But it's just for an exercise for the fun of it. I don't recommend that you use it inside your SwiftUI app. Okay, so now let's actually implement this modifier. So we return a new binding. Once again, you're going to hear me say something I've said a lot in this course, but what is a binding? A binding is nothing more than a getter and a setter, right? I don't want to write it like that. Yeah, I'm just going to write it the way I want, the way that looks good. Okay, so I want to provide a getter for my binding. Okay, so when I call the binding, what should I return? Well, if there is a wrap value, I should return it. And if there is no wrap value, then I should return my default value. So the wrap value is what is inside the binding, what is inside the binding, rather what the binding refers to. Much more correct that way. So if there is something in the wrap value that the binding refers to, I return that something. But if there is nothing, I return the default value. So this is here that we have added a modification to the original binding. And for the second argument, so the setter, for this one is going to be easier. I will be given a new value and I will just set my wrapped value, so what the binding refers to, with this new value. And I think I need to call it $0 and not new value because it's not a setter in the sense of Swift, it's a closure argument that is named set. Okay, let's see, does it work or not? I get an error. Cannot convert return expression of type binding optional wrap to type binding wrapped. Let's display it in full. Why do I get this error? I guess because I should just say that it's a binding of wrapped. Okay, it seems the error went away. So just if I don't like say it explicitly, it would assume that I'm returning a binding of wrapped optional, but I won't say no, I want to return a binding of wrapped, and it works because when there is no value inside the wrap value, I provide my default value. Okay, that had nothing to do with navigation, but it was a bit of a follow-up to the previous chapter. Now that we have this, we can go back to our detail view. And so what are we going to pass for the binding for the text field that is tasked with editing the description? We're going to pass it a binding to the description of the item and say when that binding is empty, we want to have a default value, which will be just the empty string. And by doing that, you can see that for my to-do item that doesn't have a description, so that has nil for its description, you can see that when it's the case, when description is nil, then I just pass in an empty string to the text field. And so the text field displays its title as a placeholder. So here, description. And I can write a description. Okay, our detail view is almost finished. It is almost finished. There is just one thing I want to deal with, and it's the fact that it looks really bad. Like I've just put my vstack and two text fields, and the design is absolutely awful. So it could take time to style it, and it could be doable, but there's actually a built-in way in SwiftUI when you want to style something so that it looks like a form, and it's just to use the view called form, actually. So form is kind of like a list in the sense that it takes a collection, not a collection, but it takes a number of child views and it displays them with some UI layout. And so here it applies the kind of UI layout that iOS applies by default for a form. So if you go, for instance, into the settings app, you will find views that looks like this, and you can see that, well, first it looks better, but also it looks like a form. It looks like a form in an iOS app. And so when users see this, when a user sees this, they are kind of like intuitively, they understand more intuitively that this is a view that allows them to edit some data, because it looks just like the views in the settings app, for instance, that also allow you to edit some data. Okay, I'm going to just add a navigation title to my form, so that when I navigate to it, there will be a nice navigation title displayed. Here, nothing is displayed as normal, because in my preview, I didn't put a navigation view or anything. And last thing, I'm going to add a bit of style on the two text fields. So give one a font of headline and the other a font of sub-headline. Okay. Just to match, I want to match what I had set in to-do item row. So yeah, headline and sub-headline. That's why I made that choice. Okay, so we have the to-do item detail view working. Now we can actually go into the topic of this chapter, which is how do we navigate to to-do item detail view. And before we go into that, I just want to check that I haven't missed anything. So we talked about the extension to binding. Okay, so let's go back to our to-do items list view. So the list we built in the previous chapter. At the end, I had put a navigation view because I wanted to show you the nice little navigation title, and also because I wanted to kind of like lay out the ground for this new chapter. And so we're going to use this navigation view to be able to navigate to the detail view when we tap on an item of the list outside this button that will have a different action. Interesting question / remark. What is the actual downside of navigation in SwiftUI? I'm going to cover it along the way, but if like you still have like questions or remark after that, please like ask them, because it's a broad topic. I'm going to try and give the main downsides and also explain what the new APIs in iOS 16 have improved. But if after that you still have questions, please ask away. So, how do we navigate from this view here to that view there? Will I show you how to use Navigation Stack? Yes, I will show you how to use Navigation Stack, and I will explain the difference between Navigation View and Navigation Stack. This is coming. Okay, just closing a bit to make it a little bit cleaner and easier for me to follow and to see where I am. So I'm going to update my to-do item list view to add the way to navigate to the detail view. I'm going to do that by adding what is called a navigation list. Why is the preview not working? There is a scheme selected. I was lucky, like in the first, in all the previous live stream, I didn't have any issues with Xcode, and here it seems I am having issues with Xcode. Just trying to build again, because I would like this preview to work. Something had to go wrong, of course. Just going to try and change something inside, like just want to change something in a file to see if it helps. And are all of the previews like broken? Okay, this one is working. Okay, so it seems it's just here that there is an issue for some reason. Okay, it was just like Xcode being Xcode. Now it's working, we can resume. So I want to add a navigation link to be able to navigate to the detail view. So first question we need to answer is, where do we put the navigation link? The answer is, you can kind of see the navigation link as a button, and so you want to put it on the view that will trigger the navigation. So on the view for which you want a tap event to trigger the navigation. That's what I was saying. You can see navigation link kind of like a button, but a button with a very specific side effect, which is to navigate. So I'm going to take my to-do item row, and I'm going to embed it inside a navigation link. But first, I want to take a look at all of the initializers available for a navigation link. And you can see that some of them have been deprecated. So we can provide a title and a value, or a title and a destination, or a label, same thing like value label, destination label. So title is just when you want to provide a string. So it's like the simplified version when you just want to display some text. And label is when you just want to display any kind of view. But you can provide either a value or a destination. And we'll see how the value part works. We'll start with the destination because it's the one that was there since the beginning, and value is only available on iOS 16, so I want to start with the one that is available to most apps these days. So I'm going to use this initializer. I need to provide two things. Destination for the navigation link, so where does the navigation link links to, and label, what does the navigation link looks like. So for the label, it's easy. It's just going to do to be my to-do item row, because that's just what it's going to look like, this navigation link on the screen, just like for a button, for instance. And then for the destination, it's gonna be to-do item detail view, detail view. So the view I just created for the detail screen, and I need to provide a binding to my to-do item. And it's not a problem here because I'm already inside a closure that takes as an argument a binding to a to-do item. So I've provided both, and you can see that these little things, these little disclosure indicators have appeared. I'm just going to move it a bit because I want to make sure that I'm not like covering them. But you see here, they have appeared. So they indicate that now when you tap, it's going to navigate us to the detail view like that. So here, like that, you can see the nice little animation that's done out of the box by SwiftUI, but I think UIKit also has it to animate the large title of the parent view into the back button of the child view. So it's working pretty good. We'll see, like, if here I add, no, like that, I add a description and I go back, you can see that it's appearing. So everything is working as expected, which is great. I think, yes, we've lost one thing in the middle. We've lost the fact that, you see now, when we tap on the to-do item row, regardless of where we tap, we navigate. So if we tap outside the button, we navigate, which is what we want. But if we tap inside the button, we also navigate, and it's not what we want. So we need to solve this little issue. How are we going to do it? It's actually a bit tricky to find out how to do it. It took me a bit of time to find it out because it's actually not obvious at all if you're not aware of it. And I'm looking for the place where I should make the change. So inside my to-do toggle button, so here, this button, I need to give it a button style, like that. I need to give it borderless style. And if I give it this button style, and I go back to my to-do items list view, which I'm going to pin, now you see it fixed it. Now, if we type outside of the button, we trigger the navigation link. But if we type inside the button, then the button takes priority, gets the tap event, and so we go from is done false to is done true, or is done true to is done false, instead of navigating. So that was the little trick. You need to give an explicit style your button so that it just takes priority over the navigation link. Okay. Let's see if there are other things we can do. I would like to launch this in a simulator just to make sure that it does work same as the preview. So the simulator will be booting up because I didn't boot it beforehand. Okay, it's loaded. So here I tap, we navigate. I could like remove this description, go back. It disappeared correctly. So everything is working as expected. The reason why I wanted to check this is because remember we are loading the items on this onAppear right here. And I'm checking this onAppear is called on the list. And so onAppear doesn't get recalled when you go back from the detail view. You see, onAppear was called when the view was displayed, because otherwise we wouldn't have any data inside the. Oh no, maybe because. Yes, it's because we have this. It's because we have this. I was thinking like something is fishy. I'm going to comment out this line so that now load items always tries to load the items. And normally we should see that when I make a change in the detail view, like removing everything in the text field, when I go back, we see that the changes haven't been taken into account. And it's something I wanted to point out because by pointing this out, I can point out the fact that in to-do list view, we are loading the data inside onAppear, and onAppear gets called every time the view is displayed, and that includes when we come back from a detail view. That's what I wanted to highlight. And so if you are using onAppear to load some data, you need to deal with that potential case that onAppear could be and will probably be called more than once. And so here the way I had dealt with was by saying that I want to only load items locally if the array is empty. If the array isn't empty, I assume that data is already there that the user has been interacting with, and so I don't want to overwrite these changes. Let me see, I see a few messages on the chat. So Erkan is saying, so I am experimenting with a mixed approach of UIKit for navigation, SwiftUI for building the UI. Do you have any experience on this? What do you think? I will answer shortly because the part about mixing the two UIKit and SwiftUI is for a few chapters down the road. But bottom line is very good approach. It's what I do personally on the app I work for, because navigation in UIKit gives you more control, and when you need as much control as possible, it's better to do it. However, when you want to build something that is simple, especially if like it's your first app or it's your first SwiftUI app, navigation SwiftUI now I would say is good enough that you can use it as a first approach and then go back to UIKit for the navigation if it no longer suits your need. But this only applies to iOS 16. We will see that there are a few limitations in iOS 15 for the navigation. So it's really a call to make for big apps that need a lot of control over like the events that happen when you navigate and stuff. I would say going with UIKit might be better. If you have a simpler needs or you're just doing an MVP for an app or for a feature inside an app, and you can go faster with SwiftUI for navigation, I would say go for it and then switch to UIKit if you ever need it. And you were also saying EMHO navigation in SwiftUI is complicated and so convenient for a production app that needs to support iOS version older than iOS 16. Yes, and we're going to address actually right now what is the limitation of navigation in SwiftUI apps before iOS 16. So let me go back to the list view and see what we have here. If you have some experience with iOS or even computer science in general, you might notice something that is a bit annoying in this view. In terms, I say annoying in the sense that it doesn't scale super well. Think especially if you were cutting your app into packages in order to encapsulate and create more barriers of abstraction. And what is the thing I'm referring to? It's this right here. It's the fact that in Navigation Link, I used the version where I was providing the destination. And it seems like a very innocent and reasonable thing. Yes, my Navigation Link should know where to navigate. It's actually quite a big issue because it means that the source view needs to know the initializer of the destination view. And it actually makes things quite hard if you want to decouple your app, because here you need to know the symbol to do item detail view, which might be maybe in another package. That makes things a little bit more difficult. To make a comparison, in UIKit, if you use Storyboard for navigation, UIKit and Storyboard use segues, and you say I want to trigger this segue, but you only need the source view only needs to know about the segue and not the destination view controller itself. Here we don't have this added level of indirection, and the source view needs to know about the detail view, which is not a big problem when you have everything inside a monolithic app, an app where everything is defined inside, where all the code is inside the app and there is no sub packages. But when you start to get big apps and you want to break them down into smaller features, it can become an issue, because if a navigation link should trigger a feature that is in a package of its own, then you need to at least make public the init for the first view of that feature. It might not be something that you want. So that was quite a strong limitation of the built-in navigation in SwiftUI up until iOS 16. You could actually get around it by defining your own modifiers, but as with everything custom, it came at the cost of having custom code in your code base, which means that it might in some edge cases not work, or it might break with future versions of iOS. Fortunately, there have been a few changes in iOS 16, and iOS 16 introduced a way to have a more decoupled navigation, which we're going to explore just now. But before, I want to answer the question: what design patterns or best practices would you recommend for SwiftUI apps? Are you thinking architectural patterns, for instance? If so, I would say MVVM is the nice way to split business logic from the views, and it works well with SwiftUI. And for bigger apps, I know that people are very happy with TCA, so the composable architecture, the architectural approach that is that has been defined by the people behind the Point Free series of video. I have never used TCA, but I've heard only good things about it from people that I would say I trust. So I would kind of also recommend checking it. And on my end, I've used a lot with UI, but inside an app that already has a lot of UI kits. And so it was more using MVVM because it's what the existing app already had, and it made it easier to integrate with UI in only parts of the app. I hope that answers your question. So let me use this new API. So first thing, we're going to go from navigation view to navigation stack. So this is the new API that's only iOS 16. So if your project, if your actual project still supports iOS 15, you will get an error when you try to use navigation stack. And with navigation stack, we can do things a little bit differently. Because remember when I showed you the initializers for navigation link, there was the one with a destination, which we used. So where we are the one where we need to know the destination view, and the one with a value. And this time we're gonna use that one. So we need to provide a value, which needs to be hashable. So I think I will need to update my to-do item to also make it conform to hashable in addition to codable and identifiable. I just need to declare the conformance because since all of its properties are of type that are themselves hashable, the compiler can synthesize the implementation of hashable at the level of to-do item. And I can go back in my to-do item list view. So I can pass my hashable. You can notice I pass the item and not a binding to the item. More on that later, as you can imagine. And then I just need to provide the label. And so the label is going to be my to-do item row. So just like that. Let me comment that code. Okay, it builds. So I've added the navigation link inside the navigation stack. You can see that for now, there is no longer any mention of to-do item detail in my code. It means that it's not gonna work, navigation isn't going to work, but we can see that the code still builds successfully, which is interesting. And you can see that the little disclosure indicators are still here, but if I tap, you can see that nothing happens. No navigation happens. Why is that? It's because this new API actually splits things into two. Before, so in this code right here, we would have access to the to-do item because we were in the closure of the for each, and with it, we would initialize the destination view. But with this new API, we only say, okay, we want to navigate to this item. So we want to navigate to this to-do item right here, but we will say how we navigate to a view that allows us to display a to-do item in a separate part of the code. And what is that separate part of the code? It's a modifier that we will apply to our list. So let me scroll down a bit. I'm going to also remove the preview so that we can focus on the code. And so just after providing my navigation title, I will provide what is called a navigation destination. So navigation destination for an hashable type with a destination. So here I need to provide a type. So it means when a value of type to-do item is being sent to navigation stack through a navigation link, then I want to navigate to that destination, which I will provide through the closure, that is the second argument. So I get a to-do item as an argument like that. And so here, this is where I want to implement, not to implement, but to provide my to-do item detail view, where I want to provide the destination view. So we've split this mechanism right here, where navigation link had to know both what was the item that we wanted to navigate to, but also the destination view that we wanted to navigate to. And we split that into two parts. Now navigation link is only responsible for saying, okay, this is the model, the part of the model that I want to navigate to. So here I want to navigate to a to-do item. And then another part of code that could be defined in another part of my app is responsible for saying, okay, when I am providing something of type to-do item, then I want to navigate to this view, which is a to-do item detail view. And this way, this navigation link could be inside a package of its own, and this modifier could be in another part, and this way we can decouple the navigation because the feature doesn't need to know what is the destination view, it just needs to know what kind of data it needs to provide to this destination view. And it's a better way to decouple things because in general, data is more stable than UI. And so by making the source view only know which data to pass, there is less chance of breaking my API when I update the destination, because if I update the destination UI, there is a good chance that I will not need a different piece of data. So that's why they made that change in iOS 16, or at least that's how I interpret it. It was, as you can imagine, a much welcomed change, because before that you need to do a few hacky stuff to make it work. You could still implement actually the same behavior than what we have here in iOS 15, but it would involve some hacky stuff like you would actually add a navigation item that would be overlaid on top of a view with an empty view, so it wouldn't be displayed actually on the UI. It would just be there to be in the view hierarchy, and then you would set a boolean into another object to say, okay, now enable navigation link, and when the boolean is set, then you would have another piece of your code that triggers the navigation. So it was doable to achieve the same API, API that allows like to decouple the navigation, but it would require a lot of custom code and code that can easily break when you get into edge cases. So having a built-in approach is much better. But there are still a few tricky things. So first one, it's not a tricky thing, but it's more something to be aware of, is that we use the type, we could say, we use the type of the value we pass in navigation link as a way to link these two pieces of code. So this piece of code right here and that piece of code there are linked by the fact that this piece of code expects a to-do item and this piece of code provides a to-do item. This means that we use, we could say, the type as a key for the navigation. And so if we want somewhere else to also use a to-do item for another navigation, we would have an issue because the two would collide together. So there needs to be some unicity, like you can use one type only once inside a navigation stack. Otherwise, if there is a moment where a same navigation link, value provided by navigation link could be consumed by two navigation destination, is probably not what you want, and it's probably something that will trigger a bug. So something to be aware of. But also something much more annoying is that you can see I still haven't provided the argument for the binding because I don't have one actually. Here I'm provided a to-do item, not a binding to a to-do item, and so I'm in a bit of a pickle here because what do I do? How do I get a binding to a to-do item when I'm only given a to-do item? So this is where we will need to write a bit of boilerplate code. The good news is that it's not impossible. Remember something I've said a lot of time already, a binding is just a getter and a setter. So we basically need to create a binding, which means that we need to provide a getter that will allow us to get the value for the to-do item, but also to set a new value for the to-do item. And basically this means we need to manually do what was implemented for us for free here. For here we were able to say, okay, I have my array of to-do items in my view model, and I want to get a binding to each item of the array. Here we're going to have to build it ourselves, which is still interesting because it's always interesting to see what the compiler does under the hood for us. So what does it look like to create this to-do item binding? So we need to create a binding. You've heard me say a lot of time, binding is just a getter and a setter, and so that's exactly what I'm going to do. How do I get the current value for my to-do item? So you could be tempted to just return a to-do item, but that wouldn't work because after we've updated with a new value, we would still be getting the old value. So it's not what we want. We really want to give access to the item inside the array that is stored inside the view model. And the way to do it is gonna be, it's not the most clean one actually. So I need to have a closure here, and I will say, okay, I will access my view model, access my array of to-do items, and I'm going to get the first item where the ID matches the one of the argument I've been given by my navigation link. This works because we expect the item, the ID of the item to never change. However, for Swift, as far as Swift knows, there could be no item, so we need to deal with the optional value. And here I'm dealing by just force unwrapping because it shouldn't be possible that there is no to-do item that matches because I've been provided a to-do item that comes from the array. Notice that this is only valid because there is no delete button in my detail view. If there was a delete button in my detail view, then this assumption would no longer hold. So that was for the getter. Now for the setter, to implement it, actually, if you're watching the replay, I would recommend that you pause and you implement it as an exercise, because actually, once you've been given the implementation for the getter, the setter is kind of straightforward, because it's just let's actually, I was missing a comma here. Let's actually implement a way to set the item inside the array. So if you're watching the replay, try to implement it by yourself. If you're watching live, I'm going to show you how to do it. So there is an extra step, which is that we want to compute the index. So for the index, not that hard actually, we have it here. We just need to take this line right here and just replace first where by first index where index. Same behavior, except that instead of returning the item, it returns the index of the item. We unwrap here with the same logic than before. And now that we have the index on the array, we just update the item at the index with the new item. And so this is basically what the compiler is doing under the hood when we are using this syntax to get a binding to each array of the item. It's just creating this binding, and this binding is just a getter and a setter. So it's just a view, a mutating view over an element of the array that you can also create by yourself with this syntax right here. And now I can finally pass a binding to my detail view. And so now, normally my code should build. Yes, it builds. And if I resume my preview, normally, now, when I tap, navigation should be and is indeed working again, this time using SwiftUI's iOS 16 navigation API. So just to do a quick recap of what's happening, we have on the left corner, we could say navigation link that is added to the UI, to the view hierarchy, and that will emit a piece of data when it is triggered. So here, when I tap on my to-do item row, navigation link is triggered and it emits the to-do item. And that piece of data is caught by the modifier navigation destination, which will then consume it in order to create the destination view. And we saw added difficulty when there is a binding. How do we provide a binding to an element of an array when we are only given the elements? We need to create the binding for ourselves and add the logic to look into the array and to update things into the array. Okay, so we've covered actually the push-pop navigation in SwiftUI, which SwiftUI refers to as navigation. Let me see a few other things. Okay. Then I want to cover the next kind of navigation, which is going to be a tab bar. So I would like to add a tab bar at the bottom of my app. So let me just get rid of the preview. And let me update my app. So the tab bar, we will want to add it at the top level, so at the app level. And I'm looking at the finished version, how I have implemented it, just to make sure that I don't make a mistake. Okay. Of course, if I want to have a tab bar, I don't need to have. Actually, I don't need to have more than one view, because you can have a tab bar with only one view, but it's better if you have 2 views. It feels like more like realistic. So we will be adding another view. We will be adding a new view, which I'm going to call my about view. So here, actually, I don't want to add it inside these views right here, because it's got nothing to do with to-do item and to-do list. So what I will do is that I will take my two views and model folders, and I will put them into a new one, which I will call to-do feature, like that. So I put the views and the model inside this group, and then I will create a new group which I will call about feature. This way I can even put even more structure inside my my Xcode project. And this is really important to do that, like as your app evolves, because otherwise, I mean, your app is just going to become your project is going to become totally like unmanageable. So I add a new SwiftUI view, which I call about view. All right. Let me take a look at the chat because I see some messages have been posted. So, question or remark maybe: do you know anyone who uses TCA in a production app? I feel like once you commit to TCA, it would become quite cumbersome to get rid of it later. Something similar to RX Swift. So I would agree with the fact that TCA is indeed like something that is kind of like the backbone of your app, and you don't get out of it easily or at all. For apps that use TCA, good question. I would say a Google search might help you. You might also want to take a look at like the issues open on the repo of TCA, because you can see like the people asking the questions are most probably the people that are actually using TCA. But I don't have a name that comes to mind. But to be honest, it's mostly because I haven't looked that much into TCA. So that's why I don't know like a big like app that uses TCA. But I don't doubt the fact that there might be some that do use it. I know a few apps in France that use TCA, public apps, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it. So I will not say it because I don't have permission from the developers there. But I know a few apps that do use TCA. Would it be possible, a good idea, to extract this navigation logic? What could be a good idea is to extract the part where we are, or we could say, resolving the navigation. So let me go back. This part right here, it could be interesting to extract it, especially because most of the time there is no reason for your source view to know about the destination view. So it could be interesting to extract this into another part of the code that is aware of the of how the of what the navigation should actually consist of in terms of what is the destination of the navigation. So this is this part that you could want to extract. That's a very good question. So back to our about views. So I'm going to go for something very simple. I'm just going to display a text that says this app was made during a SwiftUI course. I'm going to add a few emojis because everything looks better with an emoji. Okay, yeah, something like that. And I'm going to add like a new line just so that it displays over two lines. It will be a little bit nicer. So let's see this about view. Okay, we have this about view. I will just like center the text. This way it will be even better, and just add a padding to it. Kind of a good practice to put a padding at on the outermost view. And now we can use the about view to have a tab bar. So I'm going to launch my app in the simulator. Okay, going to put it like I want to reduce it, but for some reason it doesn't want to. But I want to have my tab bar so here at the bottom. So like I said, I'm going to add it at the scene level. So when you want to have a tab bar, it's quite easy actually. You just do a tab. It's tab view, yeah. You just create your tab view. Checking it, I don't forget something exactly. So tab view. there are two initializers, the one with just the content and one with a binding to a selection. This is just a way to, this binding is a way to get the currently selected tab if you want to trigger some action in response to it. And so you would store the selection inside an addState property, just like we've seen not a million times, but quite a few times in this course now. I'm gonna go with the simple init for my tab view. So first, I put my to-do items list view inside the tab view. And I'm going to relaunch the app in the simulator just to see what this does. So you can see for now there is nothing inside the tab view available, but it might be just because I haven't provided a tab item to say how it should be, how the view should be displayed in the tab view. I'm actually going to add my about view also, relaunch the app. And you can see actually, yeah, when I click, so the tab bar is there, just there is nothing to display. And so it does show the buttons, but they are transparent, but the buttons are there because I'm able to navigate from one tab to the other. So let's provide a way to actually tell tab view how it should display the views in the tab bar. So kind of similar to the UI tab bar item in UIKit. So the way we will do it, it will actually be quite similar to the way we provided the navigation title. So we had called the modifier navigation title in the view inside the navigation view or the navigation stack. Here we're going to do the same. We're going to call on both views the modifier tab item. And so tab item, you can see it takes a label as an argument, which is just the view we should display. And so here I'm gonna want to have first an image with system name. So I want to have an SF symbol, which will be list.bullets to have a list of bullet points. And then a text, which will be just to-dos, for instance. So how should I write it? Like that, maybe. Let's see what happens when I relaunch the app. So you can see it indeed worked. So we have our content, and you can see that SwiftUI was smart enough to format it in a way that would fit the tab bar. And for the about view, same thing. We give it a tab item. So I'm also using another SF symbol, this time with a bit more of a complicated name. So it's going to be question mark dot circle dot fill. And for the text, I will just call it about. We can see we have our tab bar working. I see a few messages in the chat. Let me see. So I see a comment for the reactive part. I think await or combine would be both similar. Yeah. I think what Hydro was saying is that TCA is going to become a structural part of your app, just like SwiftUI is, but it's just an analogy on that level. It's not suggesting to use RxSwift with SwiftUI. Combine or async await are much better choices, even though if your app, actually, yeah, that's why I love when there are questions in the chat, because it leads me to make remarks that can be useful that I wouldn't have thought of myself. This course is called Learning SwiftUI when you already know UIKit. So very possible that most of you are experienced iOS developers, and among these experienced iOS developers, some of you must be working on apps that use, for instance, RxSwift or PromiseKit or that kind of thing. If that's the case, you might be thinking, damn it, my app is using RxKit. Can I still use SwiftUI when I have RxKit? The answer is yes, because in the view model that we saw last week, I'm going to display it. In the view model, you need to expose @publish properties, but there is no constraint on how you fill the data inside these @publish properties. And you could be making async calls with async await in the method of the view model. You could be using combined publishers, or you could also be using RxSwift observables. And there is nothing that prevents you to call actually like code that exposes an Eric Swift observable to set values inside your @published properties. Just need to make sure that you set the @published properties from the main thread. That's super important. But besides that, totally possible to use Eric Swift with SwiftUI. Full disclaimer, I never used it at scale, but I did a prototype to make sure that it worked back when I was working on Eric Swift app. So it was like end of 2021. The prototype worked. I didn't battle test it, and I don't know if after I left the company, the people actually used it and if there were issues or not. But the prototype worked, and I could see no reason why it wouldn't work as long as you are setting the values to the published properties on the correct thread, which is the main thread, and you're enjoying knowing the why and not just the how. Thanks a lot. Really happy to hear that, because this is definitely one of my goals with this SwiftUI course, to not only focus on the how but also the why. And that's why I named it like learning SwiftUI when you already know UIKit, because I'm assuming that people watching have enough knowledge of computer science but also iOS to be able to easily understand explanations that require a bit of experience to get the full picture. Okay, so let's go back to my app on the simulator. So honestly, on the tab bar thing, I think it's mostly what I want to show you, because tab bar is quite simple to set up. You can see that everything is coupled together. There is no way to like decouple just like we did before. Let me check just to make sure, but yeah, there is no tab navigation that was added before I realized it. So actually, that's a good question to ask you. Like, if you're watching the replay, sorry. It's a bit late for me in France. You can see I'm starting to get tired. If you're watching the replay, maybe take a few seconds to wonder why is there no way to decouple the tab view? Why was it an issue for the navigation view that you had to know about the destination? And why is it not an issue for the tab view to know all the views it needs to display? I'm gonna give you a hint. The answer is quite literally under your eyes. Like, the answer is on the file I'm sharing on my screen. So if you're watching the replay, take maybe a minute to like to form an answer in your mind, because I think it's quite interesting to be able to have an answer to that question. I'm gonna give the answer. So I was saying like the answer is under your eyes, and it's because, as you can see, the tab view was defined at the app level, so at the root level of our app, and it's not a coincidence, because most of the time this is what you will do. Actually, the human interface guidelines of iOS encourage you to use navigations inside a tab bar, but not a tab bar inside navigation. In UIKit, you would even get a crash if you were trying to do that. And so a tab bar is something that you will most of the time use at the top level, either the top level of your app, or like the top level of the view you show after your user has logged in. And so it's not a problem here that the tab view should know about all of its destination, because it's already at the top level. And kind of by definition, when you are at the top level of your app, it's not a problem to know about everything, because the top level should know about everything. It's more a problem when a feature that is more inside, more down a branch of the view hierarchy. For a feature that is more down the branch of view hierarchy, if it needs to know about another feature that is in another separate branch of the view hierarchy, it's more of a problem. But when you are at the top of the tree, it's not a problem to know like what the rest of the tree is. It's a problem if when you are like at the bottom of the tree, you need to know what it looks like on like another separate part of the tree. I hope this was clear enough. It felt like I was saying tree a lot, but I hope it was clear enough. And so that's why it's less of a problem to decouple, to not be able to decouple the navigation for the tab bar, because most of the time, like the tab bar, it will be at the top of your app, and it will be a place where you naturally already know everything that is about that your app is about. I'm just going to show you what it would look like if you wanted to be able to get which view is selected. So we have the selection arguments we can pass. So it will be a binding. So here, what you would do is that you would probably define an enum, which would be the tabs. I'm going to need to make this enum hashable because tab view selection expects something that is hashable. And so I will have two possible cases. It will be either to-dos or about, and I don't think you put the dot when you define the cases, okay? Then I would have an at state property, which will be selected tab, which will be of type tab question mark. It's better if I call it tab and not tabs. So optional tab. Then I can provide a binding to the selected tab. So we are almost there. But I need to let tab view know that this one right here has for ID to-dos and this one for ID about. And so the way you do it, if I'm correct, it's not with a tab modifier, but actually with the ID modifier, which is a modifier that is like common to all views. It lets you give an ID to a view, and in this context, tab view, if I remember it correctly, will interpret the ID as the selected tab. I say might do because I'm going off script right now. I haven't prepared this, so I might be wrong and not remember it correctly. So we'll see how that goes. So I've set the ID on both views, and finally I need a way to know that that something changed, and so I can do on change of selected tab. I'm going to print the new value. Let's run this code. So I want to show you the console. Okay. Nothing is being printed to the console, so I might have gotten something wrong. Let's see. Actually, I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to use add state here inside at the app level, if it will be updated or not. Because for the selection, so tab item like that, I'm looking for the selection. So let's say from content associated with selection values. So here is the selection value, and maybe it should be something different. I'm not sure whether ID is the correct one. No, it's not at the tab item level. When you go off script, you always take a bit of a risk. Let's take a look at the way it's defined right here. So there is this thing right here. So here in the example, they don't show a lot of things. Just so that you can also show a badge on the tab bar, as you would expect to be able to. I'm looking to see if I can check the documentation. So putting it on the screen. They don't show you an example of how to make it work. And for this one, yeah, there is not a lot of added value. It's frustrating because I don't want to not show you how it works, but I don't want to also spend too much time on this. I'm going to try just a couple things. See. So here it's building correctly. And this is what's not being called. If I put a breakpoint, I guess the breakpoint won't be triggered also. So let's try to solve this. I'm gonna go on my second screen and be like SwiftUI. So I'm going on Google. SwiftUI tab view selection. So okay, so tab item. That seems to be okay. Oh, it's tag and not ID. Okay. So let me change. So instead of ID, there is another modifier called tag. Okay. You know, it's a good thing that I got it wrong, because if I got confused by it, there is a good chance that you would have also gotten confused by it. You know, I'm trying to find like excuses for myself. Okay, so I have set a tag. It's still not being updated, but it should be like, it should update, but I'm not sure whether calling, oh, maybe I should call onChangeOff not at the level of the window group, but rather at the level of the view. That's a good point. That's a good point. Even though, you see here, they call onChangeOff on a, so it's on a scene, not inside the, not inside an app, but they call it on the window group right here. So I feel like this should be able to work, but just for being thorough. Yeah, I know it doesn't change it. The one reason why I feel like it might not work is because I've set my add state inside the app, and I'm not sure that when you have add state inside an app and not inside a view or a scene, it actually triggers a redraw of the UI. And in the example, I can see it is set inside a view. So you know what? We're going to introduce a new view. Let's go ahead and do it. So I will call it, I don't know, like it's going to be the parent view. So I will call it the parent view. So I create this parent view. So it's going to be called parent view. It is a view for the body. So I'm basically just going to take everything that I had right here. So I'm gonna do it like that. It will be easier. So I put all of this here. DNM, I move it to the parent view. The add state, I move it also to the parent view. The onChange, I move it also to the parent view like that. And what's left inside the app itself, we are left with the window group that, as you can expect, displays a parent view. Okay. This builds. I'm going to go back to the parent view in full screen, will be better. All right, now let's relaunch the app. And this time, if it doesn't work, I have no idea what's the reason. So let's see. I'm like finger crossed. We still see nothing in the console. This is terrible because I have the tab view here. I have the add state property. I have my tag. So set the unique tag of this view. Okay. I cannot understand why this is not working, to be honest. If you have an ID, please let me know in the chat. I'm just looking at code to make sure that I haven't like missed something, or but yeah, like I should be able to set a tag and it should be able to work. This is so weird. So add state var, okay. Oh, maybe this is the optional problem. So if I remove the optional, if I remove it, I need to provide a default value. So I guess I could say the default value is to-dos. Okay, now it works. This is so weird, and I'm getting like a deja vu impression of I'm sure I've already like encountered this issue, and I was like completely stuck on it. So kind of interesting because it shows us that there is something tricky here. So the issue is that I had an optional value, and I guess because it was optional, I guess it wasn't being updated by the tab view. Um, hmm. It's so weird, but the bottom line is that it expects a non-optional value, and if you provide an optional value, it will fail silently, which is like super frustrating. In a way, kind of glad that we've covered this. That was the explanation. So thank you, Hydro, for helping me there. Glad we've been able to cover this. And with that, we've covered all I wanted to show you for the tab-based navigation. Moving on to the third and final kind of navigation I want to show you, which is modal navigation. And looking at the time, I was thinking it would be shorter this time than last time, but actually we're going to be doing like our 2 hours for this chapter, which is like still like I'm not complaining because if I'm able to provide like a good explanation and go into the details of things, it's what's important for me. So for the model view, I will need a place. I need a place to present this model view from. And what I'm gonna do is add a button in the about view where I can show the detail view. So for that, in my about view, I will embed everything. So you can see here when I do command click, I don't have the embed suggested. It can happen sometimes, like Xcode being Xcode. But you can select the code you want to embed and then type in a curly brace, and you can see that Xcode will automatically put it inside curly braces and indent it correctly. It's I think it's a feature of this version of Xcode, which is super cool and which works much more reliably than anything the refactor can offer. So I wanted to put this inside a VStack, and so below my text, I'm going to show a button. It will say like more info, for instance. It will do something which will be presenting the model view. But what will this model view be? I need to create a new SwiftUI view, which I will call more info view to be consistent with the name I gave to my button. What could it look like? I'm just going to leave hello world for now. You know what? We will like make it more complex later, but for now it's more than enough. And so the question is, how do we show a model view in how do we show the? That's interesting. You think it was optional in focus state? That's interesting. That could be so. Focus state, just to explain what it is, it's a property wrapper added with iOS 15 when you want to deal with which text field is focused, and in that case, yeah, dealing with optionality makes sense because nothing could be focused. But it's true that for a tab has to be selected, and if none is, tab view will select one by default because you don't want to leave your app with just like nothing displayed on the screen. Okay, back to displaying a model view. So how do we display a model view? This is the thing that always kind of like catches UIKit developers off guard, because it might be like the poster child of going from an imperative way of thinking to a declarative way of thinking. Think about in UIKit, how do you show a model view? You call on the current view controller, present view controller animated with completion. We know this method, and so we say the view controller will present this other view controller. We give an order, hence the name imperative. But here we are in a declarative approach. So we need a way to say the model should be shown and not show the model. And this is reflected in the modifier to display a model view, which is called sheet, like that. So two versions possible. One that takes a binding to a boolean and one a binding to an item. The reason is that when you just want to display a model and just say it is shown or not shown, a boolean is more than enough. But sometimes, and even most of the time, you might need to provide some data to this model, and so you use the item to do it. You can see an interesting symmetry here with the modifiers we had for the navigation. And what's interesting is that these two modifiers were there since the beginning. So since the beginning, the way to show a model was decoupled, whereas navigation wasn't. And actually, navigation today has kind of like caught up with what a model can do. There is a bit more complexity in navigation stack, because in navigation stack you can navigate like from one navigation to another, and you can build an entire path, and each item of the path is a view. But I wanted to highlight this analogy. So we'll go with isPresented for starters. So isPresented expects a binding to a boolean. So for that, I'm going to add an addState property, which will be show more info, or rather I will call it is more info presented, like that. So a boolean with a default value of false, because by default I don't want to show the model, and I will provide a binding to that boolean. Why a binding? Because we want that when the boolean is set to true, the model is shown, but we wouldn't need a boolean for that. Just the value would be enough. But we also want, when the model is dismissed, the boolean to go back to false. And for that, we need a binding. So it's another instance of where we need a two-way data flow between a parent view and a child view. And then we actually need the content for the model, for the sheet that SwiftUI will display. And it's just going to be my more info view that I just created before. Finally, I need a way to set this boolean to true. So similar to when we were in Navigation Link providing the value to navigate to. And so here I will be doing is more info presented set to true. So when I tap on the button, it's set to true, it shows the model, and when the model is dismissed, it goes back to false, and it has a default value of false. So let's go into the preview. Okay, let me zoom a bit, like that. And just want to, no, I cannot scroll. Oh yes, I can scroll. Okay, and if I tap on more info, you can see the model view is being presented. I can dismiss it with a gesture. We will see just after how to dismiss it programmatically, but I can dismiss it with a gesture like that. And so this is the gist of how model and models are hard to pronunciate apart, especially when you're not a native speaker and you're tired. This is how models work in SwiftUI. You use this sheet modifier, and the data flow is done through a boolean or a value that the model will display. So quite simple, honestly. Once you've gotten like the ID for it, it's super easy. But this idea of like instead of here in the button calling a present method, the fact that you don't call a present method in the button is often what can be like super confusing or super unsettling for experienced UI kit devs, because you kind of expect to call like to do some kind of like you want to call present here, but it's not what's going to happen. Instead, you set a boolean, and that boolean in turn will trigger showing the model. Now we want to have a dismiss. So let's go to the more info view and let's add a button to dismiss. So this button will be called just dismiss, like that, and it needs an action. So if you wanted to implement this without knowing anything else about SwiftUI, you might think of this strategy or be like, okay, well, I'm going to give a binding is presented. So like that. Before I go further, this is the bad solution. I'm showing it to you, but it's the bad solution. Don't do this. I'm just saying this if like someone leaves the live just after that. I don't want them to think like this is the right approach. This is the bad approach. But it's also, unfortunately, the approach that you might naturally go towards. And I want to show you that it works, but also explain why it's not a good approach. So the more info view as this is presented, and then on the button, I would put is presented back to false. And inside my about view, I would just pass the binding to is more info presented. So let's see. The preview is building. Fail to build. Oh yes, because now here in the preview, I need to provide is presented. So here we just provide a constant binding of true, for instance. The fact that it's not clear which value to use is a hint. No, I'm in the wrong view. I'm in the wrong view. It's in more info view that I would need to provide this, and I would need to give it a constant value. And the fact that it's not clear which value to provide is already a sign that this is a bad approach. But let's see why it is a bad approach. So I go in my about view. Okay, tap in, being shown, tap here, being dismissed. Everything is working, animations are working, so there is no problem, it does the job. What's the issue here? Once again, if you are watching the replay, maybe take 1 or 2 minutes to try to come up with your own answer of why this is a bad approach. The important part is not necessarily that you get the right answer, but I want to make you start thinking in SwiftUI terms yourself. That's my goal when I ask you that. But if you're watching live, you get the answer right now. And the reason why it's a bad idea is that with this, more info view has become aware that it's being presented, and it's being presented with this Boolean property. And it's not the best, because there could also be instances where more info view is shown in different ways, and so it kind of tightly couples more info view with the fact that it's a view that is destined to be presented, even though it might not be the case always. So there are better ways to deal with that. Another also issue is that we need to provide a binding explicitly through the init, and it's a little bit cumbersome. So how to deal with that? This is when we'll start to use something that SwiftUI calls the environment, which is a way to pass data from parent view to child views without going through the init. So it can feel a bit magical, this environment, but it's also extremely useful, and we will see the environment in more detail in a later chapter called Advanced Data Flows in SwiftUI. But here, what I want to show you is that the environment allows the more info view to have a way to dismiss itself. So let me show you how to do that. So you can do environment, which is a property wrapper, and you pass in a key path to get something from the environment. You can see, for instance, you can get a property to know if you are presented. If you need to know are you presented or not, you can get that information like that. And you can notice that when you do that, there is no the data isn't passed through the initializer. That's why I would call it an indirect data flow. because it's not an indirect, an implicit data flow, because the data is not passed explicitly through the initializer, but rather it's put by the parent in the environment and read by the child in the environment. And what is the environment? You can kind of see it as some kind of like a register, that key value register that you can query using key paths to get values. And actually, we've used it a lot without knowing, because, for instance, when we set the font modifier, there is a good chance that it uses the environment under the hood to set the font. Same thing for the alignment, the text alignment modifier, these kind of things. Very possible that they use the environment under the hood, because the environment is a convenient way to pass data to a child view. And so here I'm not interested in is presented. I'm interested rather in another one, which is called dismiss. Dismiss is a closure, actually, the dismiss action, but we can take a look at what it is. Dismiss action, it's basically a function that we can call, and we can retrieve this from the environment. So through the environment, we can get the function we need to call when we want to dismiss the view. You can notice I'm not providing a type here, but it's still builds. I just need to fix this error and go back to my more info view. This code builds, even though I haven't provided a type for the property, which can be, once again, quite unsettling because it's the only place in Swift where you can provide a variable with no type. Of course, it's not possible in Swift to have untyped variable when you don't provide the type. It's because the compiler can infer it. And here the compiler can infer it because dismiss is a key path, so it associates a key with a value. And this value has a type, which is encoded in the key path. It's the dismiss action. And so this is of type dismiss action. And Swift can infer the type through the key path that is here. And so that's why you don't need to explicitly write the type. So it can feel confusing, but it's not that it's an untyped variable. It's just that in this context of where we have a property wrapper, that we have this property wrapper that allows Swift to infer the type of the property. And inside the button, we can call dismiss. And now if I run my app, you can see that it works. But it works with the added benefit that now, when you kill the app, it just like pops a lot of errors in Xcode. I lost my train of thought. Now, the more info view is no longer aware that it is being shown inside a model. All it knows is that when it wants to dismiss itself, it just needs to call this function and it will take care of the dismissal. And it's a much better way to deal with it because it is much more decoupled. Interestingly, this dismiss function was introduced only with iOS 15. Before that, you could still dismiss the view, but using the presentation mode, which you can see has been deprecated because there is dismiss now to replace it. And on the presentation mode, what you would do is that you would do this is presented and set it to false, if I remember it correctly. No, because it's read-only, so you cannot do that. Instead, on the presentation mode, you have the wrap value, and on it you call dismiss. Yes, that's the way it works. So that's the code you would write on iOS 13 or iOS 14. Let me relaunch the app just to check that it works just like the code we had before. Showing the view and dismissing it. Okay, so it does work. It's the iOS 14 version, but I will put the iOS 15 back because it's better, and as time goes by, it's becoming more and more acceptable to have iOS 15 as the minimum version for your app. So this is the gist of showing and dismissing models in SwiftUI. I want to show you one last thing about modals, and it's the new iOS 16 APIs added to modals, which are called detents. So what are detents? You can notice that when I showed the modal, it took the full screen to display itself. But if you use iOS, you might know that it's not the case of all modals. Typical example is UI Activity Controller, so the view controller that allows you to share an element with AirDrop, message, Slack, etc. This one, when it is presented, it is usually presented only to cover half the screen, because this way it's much more easier for you to reach all the items with your thumb rapidly. It used to be that there wasn't an API to do that in SwiftUI, but it's been added with iOS 15, and it's what's called the detents. So I need to see if the detents, yes. So the presentation detents, you call them on the view you are presenting. So like that, presentation detents. And you can provide a set of possible detents, and you have large, medium, or custom. So for instance, if I set medium, you can see that now it's only being displayed half the screen, and you cannot even like make it go bigger. It's half the screen, and then you can still dismiss it. But you can also say medium and large, and this way you see this little handle appeared, and it shows that you can make it large if you want. So this is kind of how a lot of models, I think, work in iOS. They display in medium by default, so that all of the content is easily reachable by the user. But if there is more content, or if there is content to be scrolled, you can always like put them full screen to have like more data visible if that's what the user wants. And you can even provide some fraction. So be like, okay, I want to have like 0.8, for instance. And you can see now we have like this intermediary detents. So I wanted to show you that because I wanted to highlight the fact that it's been added only in iOS 16, because it can be actually quite an issue, because having the medium detent can be very important for the user experience. And so if you need a medium detent for a model, you cannot present it in SwiftUI, so you will need to use UIKit for that. So that's why I wanted to highlight it. But in iOS 16, it's become available, and you can use it, and it was a much needed feature for SwiftUI. If you want more details about these presentation detents, and more specifically on more generally on if you want tips around how to deal with models in SwiftUI, I actually have a video on my channel with a great guest, because the guest is the Apple engineer that implemented this new API on SwiftUI. So former Apple engineer that implemented these APIs, and that was nice enough to do a video with me to explain these APIs in detail. So I can only recommend that you check it out. How can we show small version of it rather than medium? I'm not sure I understand the question. So I'm going to try and recap it. So you provide here a set, and I insist on the word set, of possible, of available, of allowed detents. Set because it means there is no ordering. You just say what is available, and then what I understand is that SwiftUI will by default show the smallest detent by default. Let's see if the doc says something about that. So it's the available detents, a set of supported detents for the sheet. If you provide more than one detent, people can drag the sheet to resize it, and I guess it uses the smallest detent by default. And if we look at alternates, you can see that there is one with selection to know which detent has been selected by the user. It can be useful if maybe in the case where you want to adapt your UI when there is more room available. That might be a valid use case. Another one is if you just want to send an analytic hit to let your analytics know that hey, the user has been like using the large data to see more information. That can be useful, and it's nice that there is this binding, because if there wasn't this binding, you wouldn't have a way to catch the event and so to send the corresponding analytic data. So using Alper, bottom sheet takes 50% of height of screen, for example. You want 25%, that is what you want to achieve. So if you want 25%, you can add another fraction of 0.25. And you can see, going to zoom out, now by default it's 25, but we also have the half because of medium, then the 0.8, and then the full screen. And if I only give it the fraction of 25, then we have only 25. So I guess this is what you wanted to achieve. I hope it is, because it shows that it's possible. It does work. Okay. Well, I think it's all I wanted to show you for this new chapter. So once again, it took 2 hours. Even when I think that it's going to take less time, it does take 2 hours. But it's for good reasons, because it allows me to give you a lot of context, a lot of explanation, and also take the time to answer your questions and your remark. So as we go through the end, let me do a little bit of a recap, go over what we did in this chapter. So we covered the 3 main ways to navigate, to transition between views in SwiftUI. First, we saw the navigation, what SwiftUI calls navigation, which is about pushing and popping views. We saw that for that, we use navigation link to trigger this navigation. There is 2 ways of doing it. Either the navigation link already knows the destination view, and it's the simplest case, but it's also the more tightly coupled. Or the navigation link can only know about the data to pass to the next view, but the actual next view is built elsewhere. It's built through a closure that we provide to the modifier navigation destination, which allows us to say, okay, when a data of this type is provided, then I will display this view. We saw that it was something added with iOS 16 to add this much needed decoupling of the navigation. We saw that while it's nice, it adds some tricky use cases when you need to use a binding. That's why I wanted to show you this. We had to write some boilerplate. Of course, it would be possible actually to write an extension method on array to be able to get a binding for an item. So if you write code that needs to use this, please encapsulate it inside an extension of array or an extension of collection, even better. If I'm correct, I think one of the Apple example projects for SwiftUI show how to do this, because I took this code from the Apple example project. Something I didn't show you is that on navigation stack, you can actually get, you see the path and the route of the navigation. And actually, so what this path is, it's all the items you pass to navigation link being concatenated. So as each view will provide a new item, and as you navigate much further inside your app, these items will make a path, and so you can interact with this path, and it can provide some interesting way to navigate, to do some advanced navigation stuff. Not going to show it to you because it's a bit more like advanced, and I feel like with what I've already shown you, you have all the basics to be able to understand how this more complex use case works when you will need it. Then we saw the second kind of navigation, which was using a tab view. A tab view most of the time will be at the top level of your view hierarchy, because the purpose of tab view is to give an easy access to the main features of your app. So that kind of like predestinates it to be at the top level. We saw that tab view is very easy to deal with, just a view in which you put all of the child views, and then you use tab item to provide what will be displayed in the tab view, just like a UI tab item would do it in UIKit. So there is a nice symmetry here. We saw that you can get the selected tab, but it can be quite tricky because if by mistake you make it into an optional, it fails silently and it doesn't work. So it can be a bit tricky. And finally, we saw modal navigation, which is a bit different than in UIKit because here it's very declarative style. So we don't say present this view, but we say this view should be presented. We can do it in two ways, either by a boolean or by providing the item to show in the modal view. I only showed you the boolean, but as an exercise, you can try to use the version of the sheet modifier that expects an item. We saw that when you want to dismiss the model, you can get the dismiss action through the environment. And next time we will see in more detail how this environment works. And last thing, we saw that in iOS 16, the much needed possibility to have custom detents for the model, so to not always show the model over the entire screen, was added, which opens the way to a lot of interesting use cases, and which actually in some cases is actually a must-have. Having a smaller like a detent is a must-have for a good user experience, and so it's very nice that SwiftUI finally added this. So that was for the recap of what we've seen today. Next time I'm looking at my script, next time we will see advanced data flow. So we will see how the environment work, and we'll see how preference keys work. So environment, we saw it. It's the way to have an implicit parent towards child data flow, and preference key is the way to have an implicit child towards parent data flow. We actually used preference keys without knowing it. We use them, for instance, when we set a navigation title on the child view, and it was somehow consumed by the parent view. So we'll see how to use that in this next chapter, which will be like quite a heavy chapter in terms of content, but one that is also super important to cover because the environment is a central part of SwiftUI, and the preference keys are also very useful because when you need to implement what they allow you to do, there is just like no way around them. So I just have to say thank you for following this chapter. I hope it was useful and that you've learned useful things about how to structure the navigation of a SwiftUI app. Before I finish, I have a big thank you to all the people in the chat during the live that asked questions, made great remarks. You made the live feel very alive for me, which is always a great thing. Don't forget, it's late for me in France, so the more alive it feels, the less sleepy I am while I'm doing the live. But also, I think all the people who have watched the replay are also thanking you because through your question and your remark, I'm sure that you have also helped them get a better understanding of the topic. I think that's all for this outro. So thanks again for watching. Have a good rest of your day, a good evening, and I will see you for the next chapter, which will be about advanced data flows in SwiftUI. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.